Hiya, welcome back to my channel. It's Wendy here from Toonpish Crafts and I hope you're doing okay. Now I've had a few questions from people about sanding. Sanding is not an interesting subject. It's quite boring, tedious, but I thoroughly enjoy it. Now the reason I enjoy it is because it's therapeutic. It's one thing after another until you get the results that you want. I've come up with two different ways to sand and polish resin. It's not the only ways. There are plenty of ways out there and there's plenty of videos on YouTube that show you how. But this is the way I do it. I have been doing it for quite a while with the same way and I really love the results I get now. So I thought I'd share with you the sanding techniques. I'll try and make it as interesting and as appealing and entertaining as possible. Okay. I hope you enjoy it.
So if you watched last week's video, then you'll see that the back cover was a mess. It came out of the mould completely covered in lines and it was uneven, and I wanted to correct that. So the first stage I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it with water, and I'm going to use 320 grit wet dry sanding paper, and I'm going to go over the entire thing to get it flat. The reason I use wet dry sanding paper is because the dust that would come off of just using sanding paper is quite lethal. It's not a nice dust, so you're better off using wet dry sanding paper so you can keep the dust in the water. I don't go any lower than 320 grit because resin isn't that tough, and I don't find that you need to go lower than 320 grit. If you do, you'd end up having to work harder. In fact, 320 grit is a push. 400 would probably do it, but I want a quick result, so that's where I go with 320. I keep putting water on the piece to free up the dust from settling and going hard, because it will do. So I keep covering it in water and using a circular motion and up and down motion to do the main body of the sanding. I do have a bowl of water just out of screenshot, and I have a squirty bottle that I can squirt water all over it as well. This first sand is the most important. This is where I'm going to get it completely flat. When I'm happy that it's flat, then I can move on to the next grit. I use a Micromesh cloth, but you don't have to. You can use an old tea towel to dry it off. When you dry it off, you can see where lines are, you can see the bits that you've missed. And I don't move on to the next grit until I'm absolutely 100% happy with the first grit. This is the longest bit of sanding you'll do, the very first grit. Of course, you could use a sander to do this. I prefer doing it by hand because I know the pressure I'm using and I know the results that I can get. But there's nothing to stop you using a sander. Now I'm moving on to 400 grit. This is where I change the way I sand. I'm going to go in one direction, and then on this grit I'm going to change and go in the other direction. So I'm going up and down the piece, and then I go from side to side. Now the reason I'm doing this is so I can actually see what I've missed from the previous level. A lot of people say you need to sand in circles, but I couldn't see what I was missing from the previous grit, so I do it this way. But you can't see it when it's wet, you've got to dry it or leave it to dry. And to speed this up, I'm going to use a hot air blower, just so you can see what I mean. So you can see where I've been, and if you look at this little circle here, this is from the previous grit. If you don't get out the marks from the previous grit, you'll end up with a still scratched surface. So make sure you get out every mark from the previous grit before you move on to the next grit. And if you have to change direction to actually see that, like I did, then so be it. At the end of the day, sand the way you're comfortable. Do what works for you. This works for me, and hopefully it'll help you understand the principle of how to sand resin. That's all I can say really, and the lines are gone. So now I can move on to the next grit, and the next grit is 600. They do a 500, but I didn't have any, so 600 will do. So I'm changing direction again, and with this one I'm going round in circles, cleaning off, and then I go on to the next one. And I make sure that I've got all the lines out from the previous grit before I get to the next one. I'm not going to bore you with all that, I'm just going to show you briefly. So once I've done 800, then I go on to 1000. Then it's 1200, and then it's 1500. Once I get to 1500, this is what it looks like. It's actually a lot smoother than you can see in the video. It's really smooth, but it's not shiny. So now I'm going to show you two different ways to completely sand, polish and get a high shine on your resin. And to do that, I'm going to separate this board in two. So using masking tape, I'm covering up one half of it. This is a more expensive way of buffing and polishing resin. I use a Menzerna polishing compound on these buffing pads. They are different densities. The brown one is really thick and heavy, the white one is quite medium, and the yellow one is really soft and fluffy. Once you've put your compounds on, and the ones that I'm using are going to be linked in the description box below, then you go through each compound and polish up the resin. Now this resin has only been sanded to 1500, remember, but this buffing wheel and polishing system will take it to extreme high shine. It is quick and it is my preferred method because it's quick. Now not everybody has a lathe. You can use purpose-built buffing wheels. You don't have to have a lathe, but that's the system I have. You could also use an angle grinder with buffing pads, a drill with buffing pads, and there are cheap versions too. It does create a lot of static though, and you're not going to be able to see the really finished result until you've cleaned off the static dust. So yeah, wear a mask if you're doing this. So once I've taken it back inside and given it a little dust off, it has brought to the surface some bubbles, unfortunately, but it's unfortunate, but they're there and I can't do anything about them really. But now you can see the difference between the previously sanded grit and the buffing. So now I'm going to put tape over the buffed part and show you another way to polish up the resin on the other side. So these are Micromesh pads. They come in their own sanding system from 1500 up to 12,000. Again, they're a wet dry sanding system, so there's no worry about dust, and I've marked them. They do come with their own colour coded chart, but I've marked each of the mats so that I can see them clearly. And I do the same sort of things I did with the original sanding. Start with number 1, 1500 grit, and go up to 12,000. And using each one in a different direction from the previous one and getting out any lines from the previous grit. It does take a little bit more time and it's a little bit more effort, but some people swear by this method. And if you're sanding and polishing something that isn't flat, this method could be the better method for you. Sometimes during the summer I can sit in the garden with a bowl of water, soaking up the sun and just sanding and polishing, and I absolutely love that. It's relaxing, it gives me something to do while I'm in the sun, and yeah, I absolutely love it. I'm not very good at doing nothing. I like to keep myself occupied, but I still want to sit in the sun, so it's great. It's the best of both worlds for me. With these Micromesh pads, I don't dry the piece out between grits. As the grit is so fine and so high anyway, you're not going to see any lines from the previous grit. You've just got to trust your instincts that you do it right. And after 12,000 grit, it's got a shine to it, but for me, I need to go a little bit further, so I use Auto Glim. Now when you put on Auto Glim, you put it on quite thin, spread it all over everywhere, so it has kind of a misty look to it, and then you leave it to dry. And after a few minutes, it's dried out and then it's ready to buff it off. And I'm just using a cotton wool pad, a little bit of elbow grease. You can do this as many times as you want, by the way, and it's come up a lot shinier. So really, the longer you spend sanding and polishing, the better results you're going to get in this method. So I've taken the tape off and you can see the difference between the two. Personally, I like the left-hand side. It's still not perfect because I haven't spent as much time on it as I could have done. The left-hand side is the buffing, the right-hand side is the Micromesh. But to get it a real high shine, you really do have to spend quite a bit of time on it. But I took it to the garage and I gave it a full buff up again, and now I love it. Absolutely spot on shiny. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it hasn't been too boring for you, and I hope you've got something out of it. Come back and see me next week, because you never know what I'm going to be up to. I never know what I'm going to be up to. Have a great week. Happy crafting, and bye for now.